I want to thank everybody that participated today in the panels, and I want to thank my colleague and friend Rich Williamson, who was part of the Reagan Revolution and was kind enough to take on the role and has on the board so many times, and thank the many people, all of you that participated today. I also want to thank the staff of the IRI. I always want to thank you all, and Lauren and your whole team and everybody that's here tonight. Thanks for everything that you do, and thank you for how hard you work. It's a very important endeavor, and I don't think you can get enough thanks. So thank you all. Let me just say 2 words about IRI, because I like history, and I especially like it when it's told to me. It's oral history, because the 500-page books are a little bit difficult for me. There are 2 things about Ronald Reagan that I thought about today. The first of all was he liberated the brown suit for me, and as you can tell tonight, I'm happy to wear this. That first suit I had in Washington, my father's like, "You got a brown suit?" I said, "Well, the President of the United States has a brown suit." And the second thing is that I was liberated in 1976 by being able to vote and then vote in the '80 election for the first time I got a chance to vote for an Irish Catholic, Ronald Reagan. I got that half right, and I was told after the fact. I figured anybody named Reagan had to be Catholic. Dick, you'll appreciate that. But I tell you what, it worked out very well for me, and I think for the entire country. I took it to heart, and I enjoyed my time in the Reagan administration as a very young guy. And I look around this room tonight, and I see many people that were busy working for President Reagan and busy setting the scene for what happened, why we're here tonight. One of the men that was most responsible for the institutes under the National Endowment for Democracy was a man who actually mentored me when I first went to the State Department under Jim Baker. His name was Congressman Danny Fasell of Florida. And he was an incredible guy. He was a nonpartisan guy when it came to foreign policy. He always said, and I had a chance to travel with Dante many times on Codell's, and he always left partisan politics at the water's edge. And when we were overseas, it was President Bush's policy. He was the commander-in-chief. Mr. Baker was the Secretary of State, and Danny Fasell wasn't going anywhere to make waves. And he helped found this institute, as Frank Fahrenkopf told me, and Frank was one of the original 4 horsemen. Frank's also a Notre Dame fan, so that's your new one of the 4 horsemen. You're not the Gipper, okay? But you knew him. Frank Fahrenkopf and Chuck Manat, Lane Kirkland and Mike Samuels all got together. And I asked Frank tonight, because I remembered him talking about this, how did this thing get together? I've been on this board 15 years, and I wasn't really sure about it. And he told me about people of different, really, philosophies, labor in the chamber, and Republican Party chairman, the Democrat Party chairman, coming together and getting together over breakfast and working out a way to set up, and Mike Samuels, right here. Yep, Mike, absolutely. And thinking about how to do this. And I think it's amazing, because I doubt it could happen today. Not at least easily, and get an appropriation for it, and get a bill introduced, and get it through with a party that was the other party in power at the time. And so that's what we're celebrating tonight. We're celebrating the 25 years, and so I'm not going to speak anymore, but I do have a letter here from Senator John McCain, who is our chairman, and a great friend of freedom and democracy, and somebody who has had the greatest admiration and has the greatest admiration for the principles of Ronald Reagan. And he says, 2.5 decades have passed since Ronald Reagan delivered his historic speech we have the occasion to celebrate tonight. We live now at a turning point, he announced. And it was hard then to imagine just what a turning point it was. With less than a decade, and within less than a decade, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union shattered, and democracy was on the march throughout much of the communist bloc. By calling on America to foster the infrastructure of democracy in all countries and among all peoples, President Reagan helped chart a new course for our country and the world. With the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy, the IRI and its allies, and by stating forthrightly America's mission to promote democratic change, President Ronald Reagan put America firmly on the side of freedom. We must not deviate from this course. We see in some places setbacks in the march forward, and the path is strewn with obstacles. But democracy promotion should be a question of how, not if. The promotion of freedom is the most authentic expression of our national character. To accept the abridgment of those rights for other societies should be no less false to the American heart than to accept their abridgment in our own society. Let us reject the idea that our advocacy of democratic values around the globe is reckless and in vain, or that freedom only works for wealthy nations and Western cultures. Such a short-sighted view of American purpose is blind to the futility of building walls in a world made remarkably smaller because of the success of American values. A world where our political and economic values have a realistic chance of becoming a global ideal was the principal object of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. We should embrace the consequences of our success and determine the best methods for extending them to lands where they remain denied. On the anniversary of this landmark speech, I thank Attorney General Meese for his keynote address and all the other participants in tonight's dinner and today's panel. Those were John McCain's words, not mine, and he wanted you to hear them tonight. Everybody in this room knows Attorney General Ed Meese. I just talked to him before and said I'm not going to give the background on how he was an Alameda prosecutor, how he worked for Ronald Reagan, he was his counselor, he was Attorney General of the United States, a friend, an advocate, a conservative. I think it's fitting tonight to have Ed Meese here to talk to us about the legacy of Ronald Reagan in freedom and democracy. General?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here tonight. By the way, I think it should be noted after those very fine words from John McCain that we're pleased to have his mother here tonight. You know, I am really pleased to be here on this occasion. Talked it over with your leaders here, but to honor Ronald Reagan on the 25th anniversary of his Westminster speech, as well as to express my admiration for the IRI, for the International Republican Institute, and to hear the panel this afternoon. It was an outstanding group that I think gave us some very valuable historical information, but also I think bridged the gap between the era of Ronald Reagan and what's ahead for this country and for the world in the future. So it was very great to hear the excellent talks, but also to appreciate the contribution that all of those on the panel have made to the Reagan administration and to IRI. So I'm honored to be among that group, kind of winding up the evening for you tonight. I know when you hear someone say winding up the evening, you all look at your watches and say, well, is he really going to wind it up or what? And I'm gonna put my watch up there, so it might be a comfort to you, even if it has no effect on me. You know, there's a lot of symbolism in this month. It is, of course, the anniversary of the Westminster speech. It's also the anniversary of the Brandenburg Gate speech, kind of the bookends within which Ronald Reagan implemented his strategy and his vision of where the world should be going. But also, one event that should not be missed was the dedication last week of the memorial to the victims of communism. Certainly, the suffering that took place under communism is so tremendous, but for people who were not born then, so little is talked about today. And this memorial, hopefully, and what they plan to do going forward with some sort of a museum in graphic form, let people know of what went on there, I think will be a valuable addition to history. Well, I've been asked to talk about Westminster and the Reagan Doctrine. In discussing this topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan, the man and the leader, then talk about the so-called Reagan Doctrine itself and his strategy for dealing with the Cold War, and also talk a little bit about the key events between those two bookends that I mentioned, what went on between Westminster and Brandenburg Gate in terms of those speeches, and then finally wind up very briefly talking about the task ahead for those of us who are concerned about democracy. When you talk about Ronald Reagan, I think it's very important to indeed have sessions as we had today, and I will continue to have tonight, to talk about the Reagan legacy. Because as was pointed out earlier today in some of our discussions, there's so many young people for whom Ronald Reagan's kind of like, one of those presidents like Roosevelt, Lincoln, George Washington. As a matter of fact, I taught a class at the University of Richmond this past spring on Ronald Reagan and the rise of conservative leadership, and had a very appreciative young audience. But as I told them on the first day, when Ronald Reagan was president, they were more interested in Ronald McDonald than they were Ronald Reagan. And so it's very appropriate for IRI to continue to educate people on the legacy. I've often asked, as I'm sure many of my colleagues who had the privilege of working with Ronald Reagan, I've always asked, what was he like as a person, particularly by young people? And I tell them that the most important characteristic to me was his constant optimism and his cheerfulness. The fact that no matter how bad things were, he always had the idea that things would get better, whether it was for him personally, for our country, or for the world. And he often expressed this. It was kind of revealed, really, in his tremendous sense of humor. He had this ability, of course, as many of you know, to spontaneously come out with either a quip or a joke. Sometimes his quips got him in trouble, as you remember, but he was always ready with a joke. And I often get asked, what's my favorite Ronald Reagan story? And there were so many of them, as Dick Allen and Rich and others can tell you, but the one I've always liked was one he told himself so many times. It had to do with the CIA and an Irishman. It seems he told the story, and he could do it in dialect, which I won't try, but it seems the CIA, back when the Irish Republican Army was causing troubles, they decided they had to send an agent into Ireland to let them have an accurate assessment of what was going on. So they, with good CIA ability, found a man named Murphy and told him he was going into an undercover assignment, and deep cover meant that he was to have no contact with headquarters, not take a radio with him, not phone back home. He was to do nothing except melt into the community, lay low, and when they needed his information, they would send a courier to debrief him. But of course, so that he'd know that the courier was authentic, the courier had to have a password, and the password they chose was, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." So off Murphy went. Weeks went by, a couple months went by, and they figured it's time to debrief him, so they send a courier. And he goes to this little town that Murphy's supposed to be located, looking for an Irishman in Ireland. He started at the local pub, and he knew his statecraft well. I know there are a lot of foreign people and foreign policy people and intelligence people, so you'll appreciate the fact that he ordered a whiskey. Had he ordered a martini, he would have blown his cover, you see. So he ordered the whiskey and took a few sips of the whiskey and engaged the bartender in conversation. And they talked about the crops, and they talked about the weather, and finally he said, "By the way, I'm looking for a man named Murphy." Well, the bartender allowed that they had quite a few Murphys in that particular town. He said, "There's Murphy the bootmaker. He has a place across the street. There's Murphy the farmer. He has a farm about 2 miles down the road. And my name is Murphy, too." So the courier takes another sip of his drink and says, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." "Oh," says the bartender, "you want Murphy the spy. He lives around the corner." For our purposes tonight, I think one of the most important attributes of Ronald Reagan was that he was a man of vision. It was not that he suddenly woke up one morning with a vision. It was the fact that he studied things and was a very disciplined and very hardworking person who read a lot and developed his ideas over a long period of time. Today, more that historians and others, writers, are delving into his past, And seeing people who've known him over the years before he even ran for governor, looking into his documents and papers, particularly the letters he's written. Martin Anderson, who's one of the chief persons who is doing this kind of digging, told me the other day that in his lifetime he wrote over 10,000 letters. And they were substantive letters, many of them. A lot of them were just polite letters, but many of them were substantive letters where his thoughts, as far back as the 1940s and so on, revealed how he was thinking about communism. The 1940s were important to him in his learning about communism, because in those days he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild at a time that the Communist Party USA was trying to take over the movie industry and use it for propaganda purposes. And he led his union, the Screen Actors Guild, and the other unions to beat the communists and keep them from taking over the unions that made up that particular industry. And that got him started about talking and thinking about communism. He had a friend who sent him some books on the subject, and he read these avidly. And so at the time that I first met him, when he was governor of California, a good part of our conversations in quiet moments was about where we were going, how to deal with the communists, how he felt we should deal with the communists as a country. So he was quite interested in that subject. He was also interested, of course, in the nation as a whole. And so he had a vision for America, which in economic terms was how to restore the country to prosperity. You can remember where we were at the end of the 70s with the various problems of the economy. I won't go into them in detail. Energy shortages, incidentally, you remember putting your car in the gasoline line at 5:30 in the morning because by 8:30 they're going to all be sold out that day. So come to think of it, the history is almost repeating itself when you look at the prices. But in any event, he had this, that was his kind of his vision, and he had ideas to do it, as I'll mention in a moment. And in world affairs, his idea was to go beyond détente. He was not satisfied with détente. Two competing theories of government existing side by side in an unstable relationship. And he felt we had to go beyond détente to victory in the Cold War. As Dick Allen mentioned this afternoon, he summed it up very quickly with we win, they lose, which sounded simplistic, I'm sure, to anybody outside the small circle of his close friends and confidants, but was actually shorthand for a very detailed and very particularized idea on how we should proceed. He also had the ability, of course, to communicate that vision. He had this ability to take fairly complex ideas and to express them in terms that were understandable to everyone who was listening. Whether they were students, whether they were young kids, whether they were adults, he had this ability to translate his vision into something that was not only understandable, but something to which they could respond in an affirmative way. I think many times he would talk about the Soviet Union and its economic problems. And he didn't like, he had been an economics major in college, but he didn't talk like an economist. In fact, he would, instead of giving a lot of statistics, he would talk about almost in parables. He told the stories, I'm sure some of you remember hearing about how he explained the Soviet economy, talking about the commissar who went out to inspect the collective farm. And he says to the manager, "Comrade manager, how are the crops this year?" And the manager said, "Oh, comrade commissar, the crops, they are magnificent. You take the potatoes, if you piled them one on top of each other, they would reach to the foot of God." And the commissar says, comrade, this is the Soviet Union, there is no God." And the manager said, "That's all right, there are no potatoes either." He had another one he used to tell about the fellow who wanted to buy a car. And in the Soviet Union, not too many of the ordinary people had cars. So this particular fellow had saved up his money for over 10 years. Finally, the day comes when he's to go down to this bureau and get a permit to buy the car. And so he stands in line for a couple hours, which is pretty common in those days there. And he got up to the counter, and the fellow says, "What do you want?" And he says, "I'm supposed to get a permit to buy a car." So the guy goes through this shoebox full of papers and pulls out this certificate. He says, "Here's your permit, and your car will be ready 10 years from today." And the fellow says, 10 years from today, will that be morning or afternoon? And the clerk says, "What do you care? That's 10 years from now." He said, "I've got the plumber coming in the morning." Well, what was the strategy that Ronald Reagan adopted as the result of his thinking and studies in dealing with the Cold War. The first thing he had that he realized and said as a part of his campaign, and then later when he became president, was that we had to have a strong United States. And that meant a strong United States from an economic standpoint as well as from a military standpoint. And so he set out basically to do four things. Number one, to revitalize the economy. And I won't go into those details. Many of you remember those days of tax rate reduction and so on. Secondly, to rebuild our national defense capability, which had deteriorated considerably after the Vietnam War during the latter part of the 70s. Thirdly, to restore the United States' position of world leadership, which was at a low ebb. And fourth, to revive the spirit of the American people. And he felt all of these were part of a strong nation that could then deal with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And in terms of dealing with international communism, he developed what has become known as the Reagan Doctrine, although I don't think at any time he ever announced it as such. But it had to do, first of all, to engage the Soviet Union on a moral plane, to get away from this idea that was being spouted by some that there was a moral equivalency between totalitarianism and freedom and democracy. And he was very adamant about taking that on. As a result he mentioned this in most of his speeches in terms of the moral aspect of dealing with the Cold War. Secondly, it was to restrain the Soviet Union in their imperialism and aggression. And that was to send word through the ambassador that we would not stand still for continued aggression any place in the world. And thirdly, and that was perhaps most important, was that he wanted to roll back the previous aggression of the Soviet Union by supporting freedom fighters in places such as Angola, in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, in Poland, and wherever he could. Well, he had this ability then to pull these ideas together and use that as the basis for dealing with the Cold War. And he also, of course, I mentioned already his ability to communicate, but he also had an understanding of dealing with the Soviet Union leaders. Now, to be sure, he decided that he did not want to meet with them initially until we had started our military buildup, until we had started strengthening the country, because he did not want to negotiate or deal with them from a position of weakness, but rather from a position of strength. And that's why in the first or second years, he was not of a mind to have the meetings, despite some who thought that he should. But by the third year, he was ready, because by that time Congress had the military buildup going, and that was already, that you could already see signs of that. The country was already coming around by 1983 out of the slump that we had been in economically. And as he said, when he was ready to meet with the Soviet leaders, they kept dying on him. First Brezhnev, then Andropov, then Chernenko. Finally, they had a live one by 1985. And of course, he met with Gorbachev at that time. But it was one of the things he was very confident of was his ability to negotiate. As he once said, you know, after dealing with Jack Warner in the movie studios, Gorbachev couldn't be too tough. and as a result, he actually, from the very first day that he met Gorbachev, he was more or less on a path to developing rapport without giving anything away. At the first day in Geneva, when they met, it was very interesting. If you ever get a chance to see the film of him meeting Gorbachev, it's an amazing film because it portrays Ronald Reagan and also the relationship that began between them. It's a cold day in Geneva. Ronald Reagan comes out of the building, and all he has on is just his suit coat. Gorbachev comes up in this limousine, and he steps out, and he's got a hat on, he's got a muffler on, he's got an overcoat on. He looks like he was about at least 15 years older than Ronald Reagan. And of course, the difference was more than that the other way. And then as they're going up the steps, Ronald Reagan kind of takes his arm and guides him up the steps into the building. But he had already prepared that afternoon there would be an opportunity for the two men to talk privately. So after they'd gone through the normal formalities of these summits, starting about 1 or 1:30, around 3 o'clock or so, they took a break. And he had arranged to have a room in a boathouse there on this estate with a fire built. And so just the two men and their interpreters went into this room, and they started talking. Ronald Reagan talked to him about our country and that we were no threat to the Soviet Union, that he hoped that they could develop some ways in which to relieve tensions and that sort of thing. And he said, by the way, he said, I would like very much for you to come to the United States and visit me so you can see the United States. Incidentally, at this point, the people who were running the conference, the State Department and the Foreign Office on his side and so on, they didn't know whether this was the last meeting the men would ever have, or whether they'd get together, or whether this was all just futility. And particularly, they were despairing about whether there'd ever be another meeting. And so they kept talking, and Gorbachev said, well, if I come to the United States, you've got to come to the Soviet Union. And Ronald Reagan says, fine, it's a deal. And so after about 45 minutes or an hour of conversation, far longer than anybody had anticipated, the two men walked back, not quite arm in arm, but almost, and announced to the group that there will now be 2 more summits, much to the surprise of everybody, that they had already arranged this and that was the pattern for the future. But it's an indication. There's one other aspect of Ronald Reagan's negotiating skill, and that is he knew that in order to have a successful negotiation, you had to leave something for the other guy to take back after the negotiations were over, particularly if you wanted to have these continuing on a pattern. And so, for example, before Gorbachev got there, he had let the word go through the ambassador that if the Soviet Union, for example, in this case, there were some refugees that were holed up in our embassy, if they would quietly let the refugees go and get out of the Soviet Union, he would not make any big deal about it, and that he might be able to do some things that they wanted at that particular time. And so, as this happened, and he was true to his word, the people got out, he didn't gloat or make any noise about it or anything like that. And it just happened, it was at a time when he had pretty well decided that he was going to take off the wheat embargo. Because it was hurting the farmers more than it was hurting the Soviets. So as a result of that, soon after that, without any fanfare or anything, he made the order that he would lift the wheat embargo, and nobody ever connected the fact that that was one of the things that the Soviets were hoping to have done. But he just worked that into his whole negotiating skill there. In implementing the strategy and the doctrine of dealing with the Soviet Union, he had this absolute belief, as you heard many times this afternoon, in the superiority of democracy. And that's what he really laid out in that speech to the Parliament. The Westminster speech, as was mentioned today, was really the blueprint for what ought to happen. And that's where he said, in terms of the whole philosophy underlying his strategy, the decay of the Soviet experiment should come as no surprise to us. Wherever the comparisons have been made between free and closed societies, West Germany and East Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia, Malaysia and Vietnam, it is the democratic countries that are prosperous and responsive to the needs of their people. And then he went on to say, the hard evidence of totalitarian rule has caused in mankind an uprising of the intellect and the will, whether it is the growth of the new schools of economics in America or England, or the appearance of the so-called new philosophers in France. There is one unifying thread running through the intellectual work of these groups: rejection of the arbitrary power of the state, the refusal to subordinate the rights of the individual to the superstate, and the realization that collectivism stifles all the best human impulses. Actually, his feeling was that the key to democracy was a phrase that comes out of our Declaration of Independence, and that was the consent of the governed as the key to what democracy is all about. Well, there were a number of events that took place after that Westminster speech. But I'd like to talk for a minute about an event that took place before the Westminster speech, which was singularly important to the Soviet Union perception of Ronald Reagan and to what happened after that. And that occurred in July and August of 1981, when the professional air traffic controllers went on strike. Now, in the past, there had been federal strikes by federal employees, which had been more or less ignored by the leaders of the government, and sooner or later they somehow got settled, but nobody paid much attention. Ronald Reagan felt that a strike by the federal employees was against the law, obviously, and the law also provided that a union that supported such a strike could no longer represent federal employees. Now, Ronald Reagan hated to fire anybody. He had had a traumatic experience when his father was laid off on Christmas Eve from his job. And I can remember days in California where he would do almost anything except fire somebody if he could figure a way out of it. But he also felt at the time that it was his job to uphold the law, and that unless in the first instance where that had been challenged, he stood strong in upholding the law, that that would kind of be a symbol of what his administration and he as a leader stood for. And so what he did was he gave the air traffic controllers 48 hours to go back to work, and said that those who had not returned to work by that time had forfeited their job and would be eliminated. And of course, many of them, some did come back, many of them did not. He filled in with military air traffic controllers, supervisors, and the like. No planes fell out of the sky, and everything worked out ultimately. But the important thing was he had upheld the law. And we later found from talking to the leaders of the Soviet Union after the implosion of that government, and from documents that were found, that was one of the things that particularly impressed the Soviet leaders, that he would have the courage to stand up to a union, which was one of the few that had actually supported him in the 1980 elections, and was probably one of the most symbolic acts in the early days of his presidency that had a tremendous impact on the Soviet Union. And of course, I mentioned that he was taking the Soviets on a moral plane. And that, of course, gave rise to the famous speech on the 8th of March, 1983, known as the Evil Empire speech, in which, again, to the gasps of the diplomats, he said about this, he said, "Let us be aware that while they, the Soviet Union, preaches the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world." Well, as you heard, this was not exactly music to the ears of a lot of the détente group, and but it again was taking them on, and it had two effects. One is the Soviets were quite impressed in a negative sense, but nevertheless impressed that they had a president who was telling it as it is. But to the captive nations, the people in the captive nations, it had tremendous implications that he was appreciating the suffering they were going through, and appreciating the fact that there was evil in the world and that it was represented by the Soviet Union. I could go through a series in more detail of a series of events, but in the interest of time I won't, but just mention a few of the things that happened. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announcing that in the same month as the Evil Empire speech, on the 23rd of March of 1983. That was particularly significant because for 15 years the Soviet Union had been cheating on the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And they realized after only a short time, going into after he had announced the SDI in that date, they realized in a very short time that we had both the technological capabilities and the will to eclipse them in what they had been doing for a long period of time. And that was why SDI became such a big thing to them. This was proved really in 1987 in Reykjavik, in 86 in Reykjavik, when the president was meeting there with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, if you remember back to that time, put on the table a massive reduction in nuclear weapons and strategic weapons. And if we would do the same, it would have probably been the greatest reduction of weapons and the greatest move towards peace and relaxation of tensions that any two leaders had ever made. And had that been successful, they probably both would have had their picture on Time magazine as Men of the Year. They probably would have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. There was no question that this was a big deal until the last morning when Gorbachev played what he thought was his trump card and said, "But of course you'll have to give up SDI." Well, the president realized then that it confirmed his understanding of how important SDI was if Gorbachev was willing to go to those lengths to get rid of it. And that's, of course, when he folded up his papers and said, in effect, "Yet," and walked out of the meeting. Now, to the American press, that was a great defeat. But in the passage of time and in looking back in history, you can see that that was one of the great victories, really, because it showed not only the fact that we were going to retain SDI, which was a very important aspect of our ability to counter the Soviet Union ultimately and to prevail militarily at some future date, but also it showed his iron steadfastness in not giving in even to the blandishments of what Gorbachev had offered. There were other things like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapon Treaty in 1987, signed in Washington, D.C. There was the support of the freedom fighters that I mentioned that took place all during that time. There was a constant effort to provide information materials and information techniques to the people in the captive nations, including even in the Soviet Union itself. Bob Kriebel, who was one of the president's great supporters, was constantly going over to Europe, to Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and bringing to them fax machines and duplicating machines and other kinds of things so that the freedom fighters in those countries could distribute information to their adherents and would have a means of putting information out that would be helpful. The strong support of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, I believe they were mentioned today in the talks, but accelerating their activities so that they could spread the message of freedom. All of these things took place, and many other things as well. Grenada, the first use of military forces since in any large-scale effort since Vietnam, not because we were warlike, but because we had an obligation to the Eastern Caribbean nations with whom we had a help treaty, and at their request, we went to their aid in resisting a Marxist, a really bad Marxist takeover from the not so bad Marxists in that particular island country. Well, that led up then, all of these events and implementation of the Reagan strategy led up to the Brandenburg Gate speech, which of course was Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I don't think that Ronald Reagan, even though he was a great optimist, realized it would come down as quickly as it did. But at least he was able in his lifetime to see that wall come down and to see the implosion of the Soviet Union and to see the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended in victory, but obviously it was not the end of totalitarianism. As was mentioned today, there are 45 dictators still ruling their countries around the world. And so the question is, what's ahead? I would suggest to you that, as you heard this afternoon from various speakers, when we heard people talk about the fact that expecting democracies in some cultures is not realistic in the short run, but has to be a long-term effort. Or when we heard from others that there are setbacks in the road to democratic societies emerging, or that it is necessary to help people, particularly those who want to appeal to the populace generally over the heads of their oppressors. You know, Winston Churchill once said in that very famous quote, when he said, "Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time," which indicates, of course, that it is a tough thing to achieve. Democracy, the word democracy, of course, comes from the Latin word people. And people have strengths and weaknesses, and the road to democracy and the proponents of democracy and the countries that are trying democracy have strengths and weaknesses also. We see that in Iraq, we see that in other places, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We've seen it in many of the European countries. But there is a march, as was mentioned today, an inexorable march in the direction of freedom and in the direction of democracy. I would suggest a couple of things to think about as we talk about democracy here. First, democracy cannot be imposed. I think it was mentioned today that our terminology in talking about democracy is important, and it can't be seen to be being imposed by the United States of America on other countries. And so how we talk about democracy is very important. Democracy is not easy, as I mentioned earlier. It takes time and it takes patience. We in our own country's history have seen that democracy, or a democratic republic as we have, takes time to get over a lot of the bumps that we experienced in the 18th century on into the 19th century. We also should know that democracy has various forms, and the democracy, the democratic form that we have in this country may not be precisely applicable to other countries, and each culture has to develop its own, and each democracy is influenced by the culture and the history and the traditions of the people. These are some of the things that we have to remember. But at the same time, I think we have agreement on one particular point, and that is that democracy is worth doing. Ronald Reagan, in that same Westminster speech, used a phrase that was repeated today, this afternoon, when he said, "Democracy is not a fragile flower, still it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals," and I think today would include the 21st century as well, "we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy." He went on to say, "The objective I propose is quite simple to state: to foster the infrastructure of democracy, the system of a free press, unions, political parties, universities, which allows a people to choose their own way, to develop their own culture, to reconcile their own differences through peaceful means." And of course, the IRI today is really fulfilling the role that Ronald Reagan just described there. When we talk about IRI, there's one other person I'd like to mention, because I know that Ronald Reagan was tremendously influenced by him in developing the concept of the National Endowment for the Democracies, and that was Bill Casey, the Director of Central Intelligence and the campaign chairman during Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1980. Bill had seen what had gone on in Germany and other places, and he was very impressed with this. And he said that this concept of public monies going into an endowment for democracy is something that we should be doing in this country. And so he was very encouraging to the president, and I know was one of those who was influential in persuading him to support such a movement. And today, IRI and their companion organizations in the National Endowment for Democracy are carrying on that role, carrying on this responsibility. Whether it's monitoring critical elections in Eastern Europe, whether it has to do with supporting student activists who are seeking to challenge dictatorships, whether it has to do with coalition building in places like Croatia and the Ukraine to defeat anti-democratic organizations and anti-democratic influences, whether it's establishing, even in places like China, concepts of grassroots democracy, whether it's assisting the transition from communism through the development of viable and competitive democratic parties in places as far away as Mongolia, or helping women to advance their cause as participants in the political scene as IRI does in the Middle East, going into Afghanistan, for example, to develop coalitions of independent candidates so that they can work together and aid each other when the alternative is continuing the warlord concept for members of parliament, which has been traditional in that particular country, or whether it's establishing independent and reliable and reputable election monitoring officials to conduct elections in South America and Central America, or even in South Africa, dealing with the post-apartheid situation so that democracy can work there. These are the kinds of things that IRI is doing. Many of you know it far better than I do, but I think we all appreciate the fine job that it does and that brings us here together tonight. I can only say in closing that perhaps the best way to describe the road ahead and where we are today and our appreciation of IRI is to quote the closing words of Ronald Reagan in that Westminster speech when he said, "Let us now begin a major effort to secure the best, a crusade for freedom that will engage the faith and fortitude of the next generation. For the sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny." Thank you.
General, that was first class. Thank you very much for those words and for your continued support of the Institute. I want to say thank you to Stuart Holliday and the folks here at Meridian. Thank you very much for your hospitality tonight. Just want to say that Stuart's done pretty well for himself. He got his start over at IRI, and he's gone a long way. So we become a great place for people to come and to learn and to train and to learn leadership skills and to go on and do well in service of this country. I want to thank all our friends tonight, all of you people that have been involved in the IRI and continue, please, to be involved in the IRI. We have an upcoming challenge. Lauren and I and others on the board met with the President of El Salvador, Tony Saca, last week. They face elections in 2 years' time. They're already planning and looking at the problem that they face with their neighbor in Nicaragua, having their new neighbor in Nicaragua again, Mr. Ortega, who you remember very well, David. I think many of us thought we'd seen the last of him, but he's back. And the Chavez influence in that region is a very, very real thing. And one of the things this organization, I think, does well, and all of the people in this room do well, is talk about these things in advance so that we don't wind up in a situation where we did in Nicaragua, and it could be far worse here. I'd like to say two other things. Thank you very much to the members of Congress who have served on our board. David Dreyer is here tonight, and I think the most important thing that I've found in working with the Congress and on this Institute board is that members who travel take the time to visit these countries, to look at the programs not only we have, but the things that they're responsible for are incredibly important. Encourage your friends in the Congress to visit countries, to travel, to explore. And I can tell you, David Dreyer, for one, is somebody who will jump on a plane in almost a New York minute if he thinks there's a cause that needs to be looked at where he needs to make. There we go. Mongolia. Who's going? Let me just say last, the legacy of Ronald Reagan is an important thing. It's been mentioned tonight, and I had to look at my old college Webster's, but legacy is described, or the definition of which is a gift or bequest to a future generation. So I think that's what we've got here. Clearly, I think it was outlined well by General Meese tonight. I think we all know it, and I just ask that we all remember as we leave tonight to carry it on. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great night and drive safe.